the unknown. The North shapes the contours of Canadian identity, influencing their sense of resilience and adaptability. Now, can you tell me what does resilience mean? What does the North shape the contours of Canadian identity? What does the sense of resilience and adaptability means? Would you like to express?
Hello, ma'am.
Yes. Would you like to express what does resilience mean?
Resilience to adapt to something situation, hard situation.
Okay, good, good. Resilience itself means grit or the determination to stay sustained, not only just surviving but also adapting to the possibilities. Good. Next, moving ahead, we'll talk about the winter and geography in Canadian literature and art. Unlike many other cultures where geography serves as a mere backdrop, in Canadian literature, nature itself is a character. When we talk about the harsh winter, we understand its dominance, which influences on Canadian life. The struggles against nature are common themes in Canadian fiction, poetry, and painting. We talk about the wilderness and frontier line between civilization and untamed land. This defines much of Canadian history and culture. The historian W.L. Morton suggests that because Canada originated in the northern frontier, its people have inherited a frontier mentally, a sense of survival, endurance, and exploration. The psychology of Nordicity and the frontier spirit plays a very crucial role in shaping the Canadian life. This mentality is marked by also a very deep respect for nature and its power, a sense of isolation and independence, given Canada's vast and sparsely populated landscape, a contrast between urban life and the wilderness. Urban life, known as metropolis, and the wilderness, known as the hinterland. Many Canadians feel a connection to the frontier mindset, which influences everything from their literature to their attitude towards environmental conservation and national identity. Moving forward, we will try to understand Canada's identity has been deeply shaped by its vast and rugged landscape, the indigenous heritage, and its colonial history. The development of the nation was a result of the struggles of early pioneers, that is, the indigenous innovations, European exploration, the fur trade, and the expansionist policies that lead to the formation of the transcontinental Canadian national state. However, the seasons, climate, and landscape of Canada are central to Canadians definitely, but at the same time, the harshness of the land has influenced Canadian literature, culture, and history. When we talk about the indigenous contributions and early societies, we also understand long before European contact, indigenous people thrive across Canada, developing advanced techniques for survival, transportation, and trade. Some notable indigenous contributions include the Inuit igloo, a brilliant architectural innovation that allowed survival in Arctic conditions. The birchwood canoe, to name a second indigenous group, they used to create lightweight and durable watercraft that enabled extensive travel across Canada's waterways. Then another indigenous tribe, that is the toggle head harpoon. They innovated a specialized hunting tool for catching seals, demonstrating deep ecological knowledge. These indigenous innovation directly influenced European survival and commerce in Canada. However, there are other diversities of indigenous cultures also throughout. For example, there was egalitarian Arctic tribes, that is, the Athaspakan tribes of the north lived in equal cooperative communities. Stratified coastal tribes, another tribe, some western tribes such as both in British Columbia, and these people had hierarchical societies with slaves and powerful leaders. Interestingly, these indigenous tribes had spirituality induced in them. Now, there can be a difference of study done between the indigenous and the European worldviews, and here we come to talk about the spiritual relationship with nature. There is an indigenous belief that all living things contain divinity and humans are not superior to nature. There is another Judeo Christian view that man, made in God's image, is meant to dominate nature. So please have a understanding of these two extremely contrasting features of belief regarding spirituality in relationship with nature. Then we discuss about the fur trade and European exploration. There were pre-European indigenous trade. These indigenous group had established extensive trade networks, exchanging copper, iron, and flint in the north, ivory, bird feathers, and fur between Arctic and woodland tribes, corn and tobacco from Great Lakes agricultural societies. They were European arrival and commercial exploitation. European capitalized on indigenous knowledge to exploit Canada's natural resources, and you'd be astonished to know that by 1600, nearly 1,000 ships were engaged in the trade of fur, mainly the beaver pelts, ivory and hides, cod oil from fisheries, and so many. Suddenly, there was a rise of fur trade. It became Canada's first major commercial industry, drawing Europeans deep into the continent. It brought indigenous people into regular contact with the European technology and commerce, and it also helped establish Canada as a British controlled territory, distinct from the American expansion. Indigenous people also taught canoe navigation and survival skills to European explorers. The Northwest Company and Hudson Bay Company played key roles in the fur trade, leading to the exploration of vast regions such as Lake Athabasca, the Mackenzie River, and eventually the Pacific. Europeans started to colonize and then rise the conflict. Early European explorers reached Canada, and these were the Portuguese, among the earliest explorers who seek trade routes and territories. There were Spanish, who established overseas empires through conquest. There were the English and the French, who competed to claim land, resources, and trade. The first claims, that is in 1940s, sorry, in 1497, John Cabot, an Italian explorer commissioned by Henry VII, landed on the Atlantic coast of the North America and claimed it for England. England's interest in the region grew due to the lucrative fisher agencies and other industries. Gradually, there were France colonizational efforts. In 1533, Jacques Cartier planted a cross on Peninsula, Gaspe Peninsula, claimed the land for France. He then established a fishing port and trading center for New France. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, a strategic location for fur trade and French colonization. Then King Louis XV made New France a royal colony in 1663, formalizing French control. Both France and Britain built settlements in Newfoundland, Quebec, and Montreal, focusing on again fishery and fur trade, and colonization and strategic expansion. By 1763, New France officially became a British colony, which renamed Quebec Act of 1774 that protected French language and Catholicism, ensuring French Canadian invitee surviving within the British rule. However, as we are discussing about Canada and its progress in making itself as an identity, we need to understand Canada's path to nationhood. We need to understand the expansion into the Northwest. The need for more fur resources led Europeans further northwest. By 1789, the Northwest Company has had almost reached the Lake Athabasca and explored the Mackenzie River. By 1793, they reached the Pacific Ocean, and the 3,500-mile trade network stretching from British Columbia to Montreal was made possible by indigenous canoe routes. There was British North America's political development. By the late 18th century, British North America consisted of seven political units: the Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Lower Canada, which was called as Quebec, Upper Canada, which was called as Ontario. These territories remained under British control, dependent on imperial rule. But then, when did actually the birth of Canada happen in its truer sense? Only in 1867, Canada became a self governing dominion, but under the British Crown. The Dominion of Canada initially included Upper and Lower Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and over a period of time, the new provinces and territories joined, that is, Manitoba and Northwest Territories, British Columbia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. Up until 1949, all these provinces and territories have already joined the entire per capita of Canada. Under Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister, an expansionist national policy was introduced, which claimed that the Canadian Pacific Railway, which again got completed in 1885, built using cash and land grants, connecting the country from sea to sea. This railway enabled Canada's westward expansion, settlement, and economic growth. Now, Canada has been formed. We talk about the concept of governance. We talk about the modern economic trade. We again talk about the industrialization and economic growth. So, what happened when Canada started expanding? The transition from a resource based economy to a global industrial and technological driven powerhouse boosted the economic revolution. In the early 20th century, Canada's economy was dominated by natural resources, fur, fish, timber, wheat, and minerals, and then the expansion of railways and infrastructure to support the trade. By the mid 20th century, industries diversified through manufacturing and high technology, which emerged as a major sector. Ontario and Quebec, which became hubs for automobile and equipment production. Trade and global integration happened, which deeply connected to the international trade, especially with the United States, the Europeans, and the Asian market. And the machinery, electronics, natural gas, agricultural products were the key exports. The Great Depression happened, and then there was World War II and post World War recovery. During this period of time, Canada's economy suffered due to surplus of wheat rather than the Wall Street crash. Despite hardships, the country maintained the economic stability, though. Canada initially aimed to stay out of World War II but eventually joined the Allies. The war effort cost 42,042 Canadian lives but boosted economic growth through industrialization. Post war immigration policies diversified Canada's cultural landscape. Now, what happened when there was an immigration policy? Canada's immigration policy has evolved significantly over time, reflecting the changing national objectives and social attitudes. From its early empirical roots, which favored British and French settlers, to a modern point based system designed to attract skilled professionals. Canada's approach to immigration has undergone several transformations. We'll start with the early immigration policies, which was around 1896 1901, where the Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier saw a shift in its immigration approach. Laurier's government sought to populate Western Canada with farmers and agricultural workers, and this period marked the beginning for large scale government efforts to stay or shape the immigration according to the economic needs rather than purely colonial preferences. Then happened the Immigration Act of 1906, where whites only policy and restrictive acts came into life. While the 1896 policy encouraged European settlement, the Immigration Act of 1906 imposed restrictions on entry into Canada. Chinese, Japanese, Indians, and other non European immigrants were largely excluded. Preferences was given to farmers, farm laborers, and female domestic servants from the US, the British Isles, France, and Northern Europe. Further restrictions happened to keep Canada white only. A head tax was imposed on Chinese laborers to discourage their immigration. A working agreement was established to restrict Japanese immigrants. The continuous journey clause was introduced, requiring immigrants to arrive without any stops for their country of origin, effectively barring Indian immigrants as no direct ships traveled from India to Canada. The Komagata Maru incident happened in 1914 that highlighted this discrimination as a Japanese steamship carrying 376 Sikh immigrants, which was turned away from Vancouver, reinforcing the government's exclusionary stance. The Immigration Act of 1919 happened, which was soon after World War I. Canada further restricted immigration, which was based on nationality, race, class, economic conditions, political and social customs. Further, there was a shift in immigration focus from industrialization and economic needs, and that happened between 1929 to 1959. The policy was populate or perish. So there was a king or the prime minister, John Diefenbaker, who realized that Canada's economic growth depended on diverse workforce. He declared a policy of populate or perish for more inclusive approach to immigration. Then happened 1960, where the Canadian Bill of Rights was introduced. It banned discrimination based on race, national origin, color, religion, or gender. It ensured that immigration policies no longer favored only European settlers. Then happened 1967, that is the points based immigration system, where the point system was introduced to evaluate immigrants based on skills and qualifications rather than race or nationality. The considerations were given to education, work experience, language proficiency, age, arranged employment, and adaptability. Now, next happened the 2002 Act of Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, where Immigration and Refugee Protection Act introduced a transparent merit-based immigration system which considered 100-point system based on age, education, language proficiency, work experience, arranged employments in Canada, and adaptability. Now, if we go to come towards the end of the immigration policy, we come to see that there had been a competitive edge, there had been a nation building, and that too very inclusively. It had been trying to build its own nation, and there had been a lot of Canada's own development, which has shaped its economy, culture, and society. Now, um, this is the end of Unit 1. We quickly start with Unit 2, and Unit 2 talks about the literary beginnings after we have understood the development of the government and the immigration policies and what led to the economic growth of Canada, the geographical location, the indigenous population. We come to now focus on the literary beginnings. We have to understand what larger literary, social, and geographical context the Canadian literary or features started to emerge. So, to understand this, we have to focus on the first English Canadian writings, which were the experiences of a new world, which was mainly defined by the Canada's location in the north and also, especially because of its climate, we just discussed. The climate was too cold in winter and too hot in brief summer. That was what the climate was all about. And talking about the earliest writers, the Canadian experience was the experience of immigration, like we just discussed in Unit 1, which gradually became an arduous voyage over the seas and the oceans. Another theme that dominated this period was that of wilderness and civility of Canada, the colonial enterprise, which had a civilizing mission. Canadian wilderness had to be civilized by turning the bush into a garden. Natives were to be civilized through Christianity, and the wild immigrants were to be civilized so that they become members of a civil society. Canada was a cold place which had to be made warm with the warmth of civility. When men went out to tame nature, women attempted to civilize their homes, following the social codes set for the gentle ladies who should be at home. This was very much written in Mrs. Frances Brooks' The History of Emily Montague in 1769, which is again one of the earliest imaginative responses to the reality of Canadian wilderness. Living in a garrison produced a peculiar mentality, which Northrop Fire calls mentality of a colonial mindset, which needs for controlling wilderness in nature and in humans, particularly the native Canadian, so as to civilize themselves. There were Francis Burke, who wrote the history of Emily Montague. These are the early writings that we are discussing under the Canadian chapter. The history of Emily Montague is the first Canadian novel, in fact, the first North American novel, depicting the garrison life literally. Frances Brooke was already an established author in England before she joined her husband, who was the chaplain of the garrison in Quebec in 1763. She wrote this novel in the epistolary form of fiction made popular by Samuel Richardson, known as the first English novelist. Before coming to Quebec, Brooke was a part of a literary circle in England to which Richardson was also belonging to. Composed of 228 letters, this novel is a story of Ed Rivers, a military officer who plans to settle in Canada. He, however, does not settle there because of its beautiful lover, Emily Montague, who does not want to settle in the backwoods of Quebec. Besides Rivers, the chief correspondent in the novel is Arabella Furnomore, the clever coquette who is Emily's best friend. Throughout the history of Emily Montague, which is again the first Canadian novel, we have been understanding the style of writing or the Canadian style of the writing. It is important here to understand because it provides some of the earliest imaginative responses to Canadian landscape. And the novel is full of insights which draws its experiences of the immigrants in the new world, which again, you know, talks about the garrison mentality, which is a colonializing mentality dominated most of the time in all the Canadian writings, at least till 1960s, as and also known as the Canadian writers who were certain of their moral values. Garrison being a closely knit society, although Billigid has a moral and social code which is unquestionable as a British colonial institutional structures. When the center of the society moves from the fortress to a metropolis, the garrison mentality changes correspondingly. So there is another book which is called as the Oliver Goldsmith, The Rising Village, and he was the son of the British Army officer who settled in New Brunswick after fighting in the American Revolutionary War. Goldsmith wrote The Rising Village, a poem which presents a counterpoint to The Deserted Village, written by his namesake granduncle, where his granduncle um, long pastoral poem elegizes the vanishing rural life. The Rising Village celebrates the emergence of a Canadian agrarian society, which will compensate the loss that Britain has undergone because of urbanization. In the poem, as we go to study, we understand the colonial pride and the arrogance that the poet has in his mind, but it also describes the sufferings of the immigrants that is seen in the wilderness for the progress and happiness of the future possessors in the village. Now, the poem is really very long and it illustrates typical features of the pre poetry that reflects colonial imagination and is imitative in nature. There is an immigrant sense of loss, displacement, and also the settlers' excitement of conquering nature for establishing a village and defining the new place for British Empire. Uh, there is another um, book which is written by Susanna Moody. It's called as The Roughing in It's in the Bush. And Susanna Moody is also an immigrant, and she happened to be there in Canada in 1832 with a young child and husband who have retired from the British Army and was given free land to settle in the colony of Upper Canada. Now, settling in the wilderness was not only tough, it was not what they had expected. That the title of the book is Roughing in the Bush or Forest Life in Canada, which indicates that she had a double feeling for nature. Here we consider to talk about Wordsworth, who inherited from the British Romantic tradition and terror that nature evoked in her stark reality of the life in the bush. In contrast to, if we look at the attitude of Moody, the writer, there were also other aspects of the nature in the another book, that is The Backwoods of Canada, where we could see nature's benevolence and where the characters believed that in adversity the individual's duty is to self and God with strong willed determination. Now, as we move ahead to understand what all other literary writings existed during that period of time, we come to know there are different poets who also dwelt, especially Devote, whose call for creating a national literature was responded to by the Confederation poets and others who are not considered members of this group. There were other writers like or poets like William Wilfred Campbell, George Frederick Cameron, and Isabella Valency Crawford, who considered themselves to be a part of the Confederation poets. Through their poetries there we can see there are a lot of affinities that they could draw imagery and mythology from the native Indian sense of the universe. They have deep poetic sensitivity to the legends, myth, and rhythms of the native Indian people, which they have internalized to make their own. And we also come to know that there had been other poets, for example, who talked about modernism or especially nationalism. That was a phase, especially in Canadian literature, which became prominent with the efforts of the Canadian nationalists who created a sense of nationhood after the formation of the Confederation and development of the railways connecting Canada from coast to coast. The idea of a nation as a poet only true imaginative space has to become an environment that a poet constructs to define his identity. Canada, as it may be written by fire, is not a nation but an environment. This concept can be clearly seen in so many write ups, in so many poetries, and in novels or drama, where the reference to environment is not necessarily a homogeneous culture but is actually a historical unit which has made an impact on the contemporary poets or writers or anyone who involve themselves into art and literature who could easily deal with the imaginative aspects of that environment. And we talk about E.J. Pratt, although he is not the member of the Confederation Poets, but he was definitely one of those poets who attempted to bring modernism into Canadian poetry. He is central to be discussed because he has written poetries or verses which reject the romantic dreams and visions of Confederation poets. And he evokes nature and he opposites to that of Wordsworth's view of nature as a benign and a source of eternal mystery. Rather, he understands nature as something that is neither narrative nor epic but documentary, who talk about the specialized language, who talk about a technical name, who precises bits of knowledge and arcane facts regarding different kinds of poems like the Titanic, the Dunkirk, Behind the Lock, and Towards the Last Spike. There are other poets also who continued writing regarding the modernism in the poems, and where the characteristics tone is evoked and towards the sense of character or situation, which invites a reader to interpret um, a kind of a story which simply stops, which leaves the reader with his own interpretation, his open-endedness, the open-endedness by which the poets write, the narrative way that may happen at a moment of illumination or clarity of a character. The poets permit their characters and imply readers a moral choice to confront life and accept a responsibility for their decisions and actions. There had been poets like T.S. Eliot, the great modernist through Christian humanism, whose short stories now again deal with the extremity of the individual situations that reflect the internal conflict in the mind of an individual. These stories reflect human sense of loss, longingness for the lost gardens of Eden, a dehumanized world, and a law bereft of morality. We also talk about Callaghan, who reflects the Great Depression in his novels, Unlike other contemporary Canadian modernists, he suggests a way of his write ups through Christian humanism and not only through Canadian nationalism, but modernism has, in fact, for him, provided a coherent identity that has the power to impose under the concept of environment. We also have postmodernism or post-nationalism, a group of poets where we discuss about, namely, I think Frank Dabe, in his in this particular list, where Dabe is of the view that there exists heterogeneity of Canadian discursive field, who observes that gender, class, region, ethnicity, and economic structures mark texts as decisively as can nation or world culture do. The usual relationship between the literary codes or positions, between gender, class, region, ethnic affiliations, economic practices, is that of contestation and or dominance. In the age of multinationalism, capitalism, Canadian nationalism, which has been surviving enough to participate in the arguments of a nation that is being continuously, discursively produced and reproduced from political contestation. That is um, a reference to Margaret Lawrence, who asserts a regional identity by making the small prairie town of Nipawa in Manitoba, and who, through her write ups, talks about the African books, where she talks about Africa, which has formed a crucible in which she put her Canadian experience to examine some of the major themes in her fiction, especially the book The Diviners, who has been um, risking an experimental postmodern novel where it moves from realism when it uses such techniques as a flashback inserted as a set piece into a narrative that uses the point of view of Logan Christie, a garbage collector whose view of a seamy side of the town is passed down to a young orphan who is called as the Morag Gun. And in this novel, therefore, it becomes a meta history making a statement about life in Canada. Now, if we reiterate this belief in the postmodern certainties, one of the characters in the novel can be Badlands, which talks about, and especially it was in 1975, where it talks about there are no truths, only correspondence, which emphasizes the importance of one kind of a technique of allusion and parallels, and his faith in the modern postmodernism. The situation in such kind of a novel is deliberate inversion of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, the action patterned on a descent into a world resembling Margaret Atwood's surfacing that we will be studying in our upcoming times. There is another novel, What the Crow Said, which is an ironic reconstruction of a literary tradition of many myths of abduction of a human being by bees, birds, animals, etc., by reducing the story to an elemental and episodic tall tale. The writer, the novelist, deconstructs the form of the novel. So here we come to an end of Unit 2, and here we discussed in Unit 1, we discussed about the geographical location, the formation of Canada, the climate, nordicity. We talked about the economic growth. We talked about government formation. Also, we talked about immigration. The entire objective of learning Unit 1 was to make you acquaint with the background of Canada, because You might have understood, like, to understand the course to its fullest, to its core, if we understand the write-ups, like for example the dramatists or their write-ups, the poets or their write-ups, we need to understand the kind of the background Canada has, the people, the history. So all these things will sum up to make you understand more about the writers, through which the writers are trying to put forward their point of view. And at the same time, Unit 1 was important to understand, to make you acquaint with a brief history of how the entire Canadian literature also developed. So that took us to Unit 2, where we talked about the literary beginnings. We talked about there are confederation period, modernism, and postmodernism. The entire purpose of this unit 2 was to give you some kind of an idea of the larger literary, social, and the context in which the Canadian literature has got written. So we'll have Unit 3 and Unit 4 tomorrow. And in Unit 3, we will be discussing about the English Canadian theatre first and drama. How did it evolve? And we study about the colonialism. We talk about the Canadian theatrical identity. We talked about Canadian professional theatre. And then we move ahead to Unit 4. That is, we are going to finish Unit 3 and 4 tomorrow, where we discuss about nature and technology. Extremely two different poles, and then we want to see how the lifestyle and mindset, the note of terror, the recourse of myth, all these things sum up to in connection between nature and technology. So we stop here for the day. We meet again same time 3:45 tomorrow to discuss Unit 3 and Unit 4, after which we will be ending Block 1. So thank you all.